Lakeland Currents, your public affairs program for north central Minnesota. Production funding for Lakeland Currents is made possible by Bemidji Regional Airport, serving the region with daily flights to Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport. More information available at bemidjiairport.org. Closed captioning for Lakeland Currents is sponsored by Nisswa Tax Service, tax preparation for businesses and individuals. Online at nisswatax.com.
Hello again, friends. I'm Jason Edens, your host of Lakeland Currents. Thanks for joining the conversation today, and thanks for your ongoing support of Lakeland Public Broadcasting. The Muslim population in Minnesota is growing and currently stands at about 150,000 people, which is 2.5% of the state's population. It's an important time of year for Minnesota's Muslim community and for the nearly 2 billion Muslims around the world. It's the month of Ramadan. I think it's fair to say that many of us know woefully little about the Islamic faith, which can have negative and even dire consequences, such as Islamophobia. Which is why I've invited our guest today to help us better understand the cultural and religious significance of Ramadan. Mr. John Emery is the Executive Director of the Islamic Research Group based here in Minnesota. John, welcome to the program, and thanks for making time for our conversation.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
I'm curious if you can tell us just a little bit about the Islamic Resource Group, and what is it exactly?
Yeah, thank you. So Islamic Resource Group, we're a Minnesota nonprofit. We've been around over 20 years. I think this is our 21st year right now that we're in. We were founded, again, in 2001 as an organization just to help educate Minnesotans about the Muslim experience. So we really believe that education is critical to intercultural understanding and cooperation. So to that mission, or to that belief, we've been training for the past 20 years or so Muslim speakers to go around to different audiences all across the state, and in fact the 5-state area, just to talk about what it means to be Muslim.
So where might a speaker go, for example?
Oh my goodness. Oftentimes, most often actually, we're helping facilitate learning for high school students and middle school students. So since learning about the 5 major world religions is a part of the state school curriculum. Oftentimes teachers around the state, the average Minnesota school teacher doesn't have a personal experience or deep knowledge about what it means to be Muslim. So they'll invite in one of our speakers just to share with the students a little, authentic experience about what it means to be Muslim, as opposed to simply learning it straight from the textbook, which can be, a little dry and boring. So schools are a big audience for us, from kindergarten all the way up to college level. The other thing is we do a lot of interfaith, so we travel to churches all across the state, and again, the 5-state region, just doing interfaith conversations, making connections, building bridges, understanding how we can work together as faith communities to achieve, social justice and positive ends and good work in the world. But we also do diversity training for businesses, for government, as well as law enforcement as well.
Oh,
so we speak in healthcare too. We speak to a wide variety of audiences just to help them achieve their goals. Oftentimes, again, if it's a public-facing institution, like maybe, again, a hospital or something like that, we can come help facilitate some conversations on how they can provide better services to their Muslim patients.
Are your speakers of all ages?
Oh my goodness, yes. Yeah, it's a great range. One of our newest speakers, she is a freshman at the University of Minnesota. And I think our oldest, we have speakers who actually are still with us after 20 years who founded the organization. Who are getting kind of not elderly, but elder folks in our community. So it's a really broad range of experience and diverse backgrounds, because we also reflect in our speaker base the diversity within the local Muslim community. So obviously here in Minnesota we have a majority of East Africans in the Muslim community, but we have Muslims from everywhere that a Muslim can come from in the world. And our speaker base, our volunteer speakers, reflect that diversity. So both in terms of nation of origin, age, experience, men and women. So it's a real diverse community. So when somebody invites in a speaker, sometimes you don't know who you're gonna get, but it's gonna be somebody with an interesting background and story to share with you. So it's a lot of fun.
This is true for any world faith, but there's sort of a fine line between education and proselytizing, right? So how do you navigate or negotiate that space?
Yeah, that's great. That's really important to us, because for Islamic Resource Group, most of our presentations or dialogues are done in public space, right? In a space which is not sort of a faith setting, right? So we do, like I said, we go to churches and other houses of worship, and most of the time we're in schools or businesses or something like that, right? So we've always been very careful to navigate that space in the sense that we believe in education. So we talk about what it means to be Muslim, what our experiences are, and we talk about the faith of Islam. without teaching the faith, right? That's an important distinction to us. And we also very, very much believe in, the principle of the First Amendment, right? So we do not proselytize, right? We do not promote or denigrate any particular faith. So when our speakers, we're all very carefully vetted and trained so that when, we talk about what it means to be Muslim, we are, again, speaking about the faith as opposed to proselytizing or promoting the faith, right? And that's very important to us, especially in, school spaces.
Absolutely.
So again, we do want to provide that personal experience. What does it mean to be Muslim? But on the other hand, like I said, it is an educational opportunity. It's not an opportunity for us to, as you say, to proselytize.
Well, as I mentioned just a moment ago, this is a very important time of the year for nearly 2 billion people on the planet. Yes. However, some of our viewers may not be familiar with Ramadan. So I was wondering if you could just simply define it and help us basically understand what it is. What is Ramadan?
Yeah. There's so many approaches we can take to the topic. It's so vast, and again, for Muslims who are practicing, it's such a rewarding and I guess a deep practice, right, and time of the year. So, but I'll approach simply like the basics. What is it, sort of mechanically? So Ramadan, first of all, is the name of the 9th month on the Islamic calendar. And what Muslims believe, and of course Muslims believe in a loving, merciful God, and Muslims believe there are certain things that they should be doing throughout their lives. And there's 5 core actions, right? And we refer to these oftentimes, and people may have heard, like the 5 pillars of Islam, right? Which includes things like the testimony of faith and prayer, giving a wealth tax every year, making the pilgrimage every year, making the pilgrimage at least once in a Muslim person's lifetime. And so fasting is one of those 5 pillars. And Muslims believe that God commands Muslims in the Quran, the sacred text of Islam, to fast during the month of Ramadan so that you might become more righteous, or might become, what's another way, more pious people. Or another way of paraphrasing that would be fast during the month of Ramadan so that you might improve your relationship with God, right? A favorite scholar I listen to often expresses it that way. So, and how it works is so during the month of Ramadan, which is usually about 30 days, Muslims fast every day from dawn until sunset, right? So starting dawn, I believe dawn for me this morning was 5 a.m. Sunset today for where I live is 8 p.m. So that means from 5 a.m. till 8 p.m., me and other Muslims in my city who are fasting will be fasting from 5 till 8. And what that means as well for Muslims, because I know we've got kind of, it's beautiful this year because we have this overlap with sacred time this year in terms of Lent and Passover and Ramadan. Different fasting times for these different communities. So for Muslims, what fasting means is abstaining from all food and all drink during the daylight hours, dawn until sunset.
Including water?
Not even water, all day long.
Interesting.
Right? Yeah. At sunset, Muslims break their fast, traditionally with maybe some dates and milk, traditionally something kind of a light, and do their sunset prayer, and then eat their dinner after the sunset prayer is done. And then during the nighttime hours, when Muslims aren't sleeping or praying or engaging in other acts of worship, they can eat and drink normally. But then waking up early before dawn and having a light breakfast, and then again fasting the next day for the 30 days of Ramadan.
So Ramadan is the 9th month in the Islamic calendar. So does that mean then that Ramadan occurs at different times of the year each year?
Yeah, exactly, right? That's an important distinction because it's always the 9th month of the year on the Islamic calendar. But what's unique or different about the Islamic calendar is that it's a lunar calendar. So, right, the January, February, March, right, that's based on the sun. It's a solar calendar,
sure.
Right? So, the seasons come at the same, right, the same months hopefully they come at the same months every year, right? We're a little late on spring this year. But be that as it may, so what that means is for Ramadan, it's lunar, and the lunar calendar is 11 days shorter. So every year Ramadan arrives 11 days earlier.
I see.
So one of the really fun things that I've experienced in I think about 18 years of fasting for me since I've been a Muslim is that no 2 Ramadans are ever quite the same because it's not a seasonal holiday, right? Every Ramadan brings its own sort of just different joys with it because the day length is changing. Right? I started fasting, I believe it was fall, so shorter days, cooler weather, and then through my life as a Muslim, Ramadan traveled through the summer solstice, the longest day of the year, right? Very hot, long days for us, and then now we're kind of approaching. I think in about 10 years or so, Muslims, at least in Minnesota, all over the world, Muslims will be fasting around Christmas time. Again, which for us is the shortest day of the year, right?
Sure.
So yeah, it's every year it brings its fresh challenges and fresh rewards, right? Either be day length or temperature, because this is the first Ramadan I can remember that there's been snow on the ground, right? So we have a very cool Ramadan this year, whereas, like I said, previous years, it's been very warm or even hot.
That's really interesting that there's this geographic component, right?
Yeah.
So does that mean then that during the month of Ramadan, depending on where a practicing Muslim lives, the length of the fast will vary?
Yeah. Again, so I think in terms of the practice of being Muslim, oftentimes the practices are very much connected, with, with the how do I want to say this? If you look at the prayers, the daily prayers, for example, they happen at certain times of the day: dawn, noon, mid-afternoon, right after sunset, and in the evening. And even those times can change depending on what season you're in and where you live, exactly. So depending on where you live, you might be breaking your fast and starting your fast at different times, different clock times, right? It's dawn in Minnesota and maybe dawn at the equator, but the clock times are going to be very different. So people who are living closer to the equator will actually not fast as long as we do in the summer, right? But we might fast a shorter period of time in the winter compared to somebody maybe who's living on the equator, right? Yeah, so it's very interesting how the practice oftentimes is tied into the reality of where we live.
That's super interesting to me. So I just want to ask one more question about that. What if there's a practicing Muslim in a Nordic country, for example, and Ramadan happens to fall near summer solstice? That could be a very arduous fast, couldn't it be? Because sunrise to sunset is potentially 20 hours or so.
Or even I believe there's, in Northern Europe, there are Muslim communities in Northern Europe, and I believe they're above the Arctic Circle, so where the sun doesn't set. It's, if Ramadan happens in the summertime, then right? I mean, you can't not eat and drink for a week or two, however long that is. So it kind of depends on each local community, to the best of my knowledge, will make their own decision.
I see.
Sometimes what they will do is they will pray according to a city further south. Again, if we're talking about the northern hemisphere. So a city above the Arctic Circle might pray and fast according to this time of a city below the Arctic Circle where the sun does set, right? So again, because it's not reasonable to never eat and drink, so they'll make some kind of accommodation, sort of to fast on a slightly different time.
Sure.
Still fasting, still breaking their fast, but doing it in a way that's healthy for them.
Sure. Well, speaking of reasonableness, I was going to ask you about that. Are there any exceptions that are made, for example, for people that are suffering with a chronic illness or for the elderly or anything else?
So it is an obligation, right? Fasting is an obligation for Muslims, but a person should be a healthy adult to be obligated to fast. So yes, there are exceptions and exemptions for fasting. So like you said, if somebody has a chronic condition, if they're managing diabetes, for example, they may have an exemption from fasting. Right. Some people, I know Muslims who are diabetic and they're able to manage and still fast, but some may not be able to. Women who are nursing or pregnant also have an exemption if they choose. It's very unique for different Muslims because some Muslims can, right?
Sure.
But some may not be able to. So there's exemptions there for people who need it for health reasons.
So it's sort of based on one's individual constitution and their ability or their stamina in a way.
If there's a health condition or some kind of condition in the way.
Sure.
Like I said, even traveling, there's an exemption for Muslims who are traveling.
Oh, okay.
So if a person is traveling a long distance, then during Ramadan, then they have an exemption that they can take during that time. Right, especially if you can imagine, like in the today, if you're driving on the freeway, doing 70 miles an hour, driving along, hours and hours during Ramadan. Of course, it might be safer for that person just to break their fast so they don't get a little drowsy behind the wheel, for example.
Sure.
Right?
And at what age is a Muslim expected to begin observing Ramadan?
The obligation is for adult Muslims.
I see.
So usually, if you look at pre-modern faith traditions, and Judaism might be a good example too, right? Bar mitzvah, bat mitzvah, 13 years old, right? So in the Muslim tradition, it's usually, puberty is considered the onset of religious responsibility. So, again, that's not like a solid, a fixed number, but it's kind of up to the individual. But usually around that age of 13 is when Muslims believe that they become responsible or obligated to practice the faith, right, with prayer and fasting and so on and so forth. In my experience, with other Muslims and raising our own children, is that what we try to do is we try to teach the good habits when they're younger, right? So as the kids are growing up, we will try to maybe encourage them to fast a little bit, When they're very young, they might start noticing, because Ramadan is such a special time for us. So we want the children to have a great time as well too. We're going to the mosque, and they get to stay up late past their bedtimes during Ramadan, right? So it's a very special time for the kids too, right? And so insofar as they experience it, but at some point they start to realize, we're teaching them, mom and dad are fasting. So then they say like, well, I would like to fast too, right? They want to be a part of the festivities and the celebration and the worship and everything that's going on. And then so at a young age, we might say like, oh, now you can skip your snack today. Depending on what time of year you get home from school, you maybe skip your snack when you get home from school, and then you're fasting with mom and dad and brothers and sisters, right? And as they age, as they're approaching that age of 13 or so, maybe fasting a little bit more each day, or maybe fasting a whole day or several days or so, so sort of building up to adulthood or building up to that responsibility.
Sure.
So by the time they hit that age, then they're ready to experience and worship with with the family and with the community. So 13 is kind of roughly the age, but we try to work them up to it and give them practice doing it up to that.
Well, it's my understanding, John, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that there are basically two denominations, for lack of a better term, within the Islamic world, Sunni and Shia. And I'm curious, do both Sunni and Shia Muslims practice or observe Ramadan in a similar fashion, or are there any differences?
Yeah, to the best of my knowledge, it's very similar. So, and again, I'm going to generalize a little bit here, because when we talk about, like you said, almost 2 billion Muslims in the world, I mean, there are many exceptions and many different sorts of communities, but generally speaking, the practice, to the best of my knowledge, is the same, right? So yeah, Shia Muslims, or at least most of them that I'm aware of or familiar with, they do practice Ramadan as well, dawn until sunset fasting and so on and so forth. I'm going to segue a little bit, and we have 2 Shiite mosques in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. And in fact, one of them is inviting guests in as a part of a series called Taking Heart every year.
Taking Heart every year.
Yes.
Okay.
So, and I'll explain. So Taking Heart is a series of special community events that happen at mosques during the month of Ramadan every year, almost every year, because the last 2 years we've taken time off. But the Minnesota Council of Churches helps mosques across the state organize during the month of Ramadan like special open houses. So if you go to any mosque, most mosques in the state and in the world will have breaking fast dinners in the evening. So, Muslims will go to their local mosque, at sunset, break fast with their fellow Muslims, pray at the mosque, and then sit down to dinner at that mosque.
Oh, really? At the mosque?
Yeah, absolutely. Very common. So most mosques are doing that oftentimes every night during Ramadan with the intention of being primarily for the Muslim community.
Sure.
Way. But many, many mosques, I think 19 this year, in collaboration with the Minnesota Council of Churches, are hosting special open house breaking fast dinners, right? Where it's, of course, come in as a Muslim, come and break fast this evening, but also intentionally inviting in members of the community, neighbors, local leadership, mayors, and so on and so forth. Come into the mosque so you can kind of learn a little bit about what a mosque is, what it looks like, who the people are, get to know your Muslim neighbors, but also just to take the time to break fast with your neighbors, your Muslims who are fasting and celebrating the sacred month of Ramadan. This year, as I said, I think we have 19 this year who are participating in the Taking Heart dinners. And in fact, one of those 19 is one of the Shiite mosques in the Minneapolis area. So they're also participating in the same program and welcoming people into their mosque as well, just to share a little bit about them and their community and kind of what the month means to them.
I'm curious about sort of the religious foundation of Ramadan. Is one of its objectives, if you will, to instill a sense of compassion for those that are food insecure?
You'll hear that a lot from different Muslims. That's a meaningful connection that many Muslims have during the month of Ramadan, right? Having a sense of empathy for people, right? They'll say maybe for people who don't have enough to eat every day, right? But if we look sort of at the faith and what the faith teaches, is that again, it's what Muslims believe is God says in the Quran, fast so that you might become more pious or more righteous people. So sort of objectively, if we look at the faith, that's the real reason that Muslims believe they should fast, is because of the connection to God and developing, that better connection with God, right? And working on their behavior, and we can talk more about that in a moment. But so yeah, I would say many Muslims do really connect with that sense of compassion, feeling that compassion, but I tend to kind of lean more on the strict sense, and that we do this, or Muslims believe they do this, because it's about that act of worship, and it's about that connection with God that as Muslims, right, that's kind of 12 months out of the year, that's really our intention, is to work on that connection with God, right? And to fulfill what God wants us to do, right? Because as Muslims believe in a loving, merciful God who wants good things for us. And since God created us, then Muslims trust that what God wants us to do is the best thing for us. But the reality is, working on our relationship with God also does mean that charity and these things, and service and good deeds and so on and so forth, right? So as Muslims are working on their relationship with God, it also does, right? Because Muslims believe what God wants us to do is to serve other people. And so that also, so there is that connection with other people and the compassion and service and so on and so forth. So that is real. So yeah, I totally respect that as well.
So you describe Ramadan as a very joyous time of year, very even celebratory. This might be my inference, but I hear you say it's a very celebratory time as well. Can you describe the process of breaking the fast on a daily basis? Is this also a time to be with family and friends?
Oh my goodness, yeah. When we began this, like I said, there's so many different ways we can approach this in terms of how individual Muslims approach this and kind of what the rewards are for, because every Muslim approaches Ramadan and fasting with their own challenges, what they're working on in their life and so on and so forth. So sometimes the rewards can be very different too. I would say, let me start, it is an act of worship, right? So again, it's Muslims working on their relationship with God, trying to be more, righteous and sort of, do better what God wants them to do, right? So there is this very serious aspect to it where it is worship, it is very intentional, right? But to me, again, I experience it very much. There is, with worship and, with the love of God, there also is, a sense of joy and celebration to me, because it is a time of community, right? We can't, an individual Muslim can do it on their own. Sometimes that happens if people are, living in a remote place where they don't have a Muslim community. But really, for Muslims, the ideal is to do it as a community, right? So what you'll see is, again, many Muslims, what we do is, wake up at home as a family, usually, have an early morning breakfast, right? Before dawn, that early morning breakfast can be very important, and then once that's done, we set aside our food and our drink, wash the dishes maybe, go do our morning prayer. And, at that, Ramadan is life. So it's not an exemption from our normal responsibilities, right? We work and, whatever we're doing, we fulfill our normal responsibilities.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about that. Excuse me for interrupting, but I wanted to ask you a little bit about the practicalities of observing Ramadan and yet still being teachers and firefighters and engineers and CEOs. Are there any accommodations that are made or any accommodations that are appropriate?
Sometimes there can be. A friend of mine, she has a daughter who's in, about the same age as my oldest daughter, about 7th grade right now. And she's in basketball right now, right? So it's traveling basketball. And they have a tournament, I think she was telling me they have a tournament next weekend, right? So she's traveling, I believe, to Wisconsin to play basketball and engage in this tournament. But for her, again, as a Muslim, because Ramadan is such an important time of the year, she's not going to set aside fasting. She's not going to sacrifice this sacred time or sacrifice the practice for for basketball or these other concerns. Basketball, this is an important hobby for her. It brings her a great deal of joy in her life. But Ramadan for Muslims, I would say, is more important. So even if Muslims are doing, farmers, like I said, when Ramadan is the summer, farming is hard. There's many people working outdoors. Muslims are still going to fast if they can, right? If it's possible, they still will fast. So some of the accommodations typically we ask for are maybe some flex time, if possible. If Muslims can adjust their schedule, maybe working earlier in the morning, so they can maybe have a nap in the afternoon. Just giving them some flex time to kind of work around their schedule. They can still do their 8-9 hours, but just kind of adjusting the time a little bit is very helpful. If somebody's working a shift schedule, making sure that they're able to break their fast at sunset. Again, we have many Muslims in greater Minnesota, right? Oftentimes working at like meat plants, Genio, those kinds of plants, right? So those lines, they run oftentimes 24/7. But the accommodations that's been made at many of them is they will actually shut down the line if they have a lot of Muslim employees. They'll actually stop the line for a few minutes so that those Muslim employees can go break their fast and eat a little bit of dinner, do their prayers, and then they'll come back and start up that line again and keep working. Right? So some accommodations like that are very reasonable and helpful to Muslims, but for the most part, it's doing our normal routine.
Unfortunately, we probably only have time for one more question, but I'm really eager to learn a little bit about the festival that marks the end of Ramadan. I was wondering if you could tell us about that.
They're the two most important holidays on the Muslim calendar. We call them Eid. So E-I-D is an Arabic word. And in Arabic, yeah, Eid. So in Arabic, it means holiday. But in English, we kind of kept that word to refer to specifically the two major Muslim holidays every year. So the second most important one happens after Ramadan is over every year. So I believe the predicted date for that this year, oh my goodness, I believe it's May 2nd.
Okay.
If memory serves, my memory gets a little fuzzy this time of year, but I believe that's May 2nd. It's a great holiday. So Muslims, after that last day of fasting, early the next morning, Muslims wake up and go to a special morning prayer as a community, right? Again, it's a community prayer, worship service that Muslims do together. And oftentimes it'll be like, in my experience, it's oftentimes the biggest prayer of the year, or one of the two biggest prayers of the year.
In terms of turnout?
In terms of turnout,
okay,
yeah. And
sure.
oftentimes Muslims won't do it at the mosque. They'll actually do it at maybe a community center or a high school gymnasium because it's kind of one of those things. Everybody comes together. Mm-hmm. It's so important to Muslims. And celebrate that early morning prayer together, and then spend 1, 2, or maybe even 3 days just celebrating the holiday. Traditionally, it's a 3-day holiday, and many Muslims here will practice it as a 3-day holiday. Some Muslims might just take the 1 day off of work or school, but if we can, we'll spend that 3 days visiting with other Muslims, having lots of open houses, going to different like little carnivals. Making it fun for the kids.
Sure.
But really, it's a holiday. It's just a ton of fun, just like other faith communities celebrate their holidays as well. But yeah, and so it's called Eid. And so one thing that's, I guess, very welcome to hear from our friends who aren't Muslim is the expression Blessed Eid. That's the expression that Muslims use with each other when Eid arrives. We say Blessed Eid, or in Arabic, we say Eid Mubarak. And so it's a welcome expression to hear from our neighbors who aren't Muslim. And I'd invite people, you and others to use that expression if they have Muslim friends to say, hey, Eid Mubarak, right? Because it's great, when people know kind of what we're going through, it's just such a joy to hear that.
Absolutely.
And it's always such a pleasure to hear Eid Mubarak from our neighbors and stuff.
So Eid Mubarak is something that people say at the end of Ramadan, not during Ramadan.
Yeah, not during, after, right? So like I said, I believe the predicted date is May 2nd this year. So yeah, after Ramadan is over, the first day of the next month on the Islamic calendar, we say Eid Mubarak.
John, it was such a pleasure to meet you, and I want to thank you so much for helping us better understand Ramadan. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. This has been a great pleasure. Thank you.
And thank all of you for joining me once again. You can continue the conversation on Twitter. Tweet me at CurrentsPBS. I'm Jason Edens, your host of Lakeland Currents. Be kind and be well. We'll see you next week.